Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. How to define the word reality? Something like this: the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. To say the least, this is a philosophical definition. Let's throw in politics now. Is there one political reality? Can and should one be enforced? Would this, in the end, produce a ministry of truth? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by my guest, Tom Borelli. In Greenwich, he is a contributor with Real America's Voice. In Austin, we have Daniel Bonevac. He is a professor of philosophy and human dimensions of organizations at the University of Texas, Austin. And in Paris, we have John Laughland. He is a university lecturer in history and political philosophy. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let's go to Tom first. You know, in looking at what's been going on in the media and our politics during the election and since then, it seems to me that there's an attack on diversity, which of course these attacks on conservative opinions is in the name of having a more diverse political environment, but actually it's just creating the reverse. They want to have a monopoly of speech here. And, you know, we've heard terms like a reality czar, and a reality czar is people writing about it with a straight face. I mean, not with any form of irony whatsoever. So the people that are talking about diversity of opinions actually want the opposite. Go ahead.
No, that's absolutely right. Essentially, what's going on now, they want to really control information so that they can control the debate. And we've seen what happened during the 2020 election with, President Trump against Joe Biden. And what we saw was, organizations like Twitter enforce their view of reality, and that ended up with them preventing and spiking the New York Post story about Hunter Biden's laptop. The American people were denied a lot of information about Biden and the family because of the Twitter and social media cracking down on free speech. If the government gets involved in that sort of determining what's reality, what's not, we're only going to see more of that. It's about control of public opinion, and that's what they want to do.
You know, Daniel, one of the things that I find very, very interesting is that it seems to me, at least logically speaking, the cutting out of other voices, and primarily conservative, but progressive as well, let's be fair here. My sense is that these people just don't have any arguments, so they don't want to have a debate. Because having a debate legitimizes your interlocutor. They want to delegitimize their interlocutor along with the idea. You can't have a functioning public square if you want to have an inclusive society, if you play it that way. Go ahead, Dan.
I think that's exactly right. It is surprising to me, actually, that on some of these issues, on the integrity of the election, for example, or on various therapies for COVID-19 or a variety of other questions, there seems to be no actual willingness to make the case on that side. Instead, people simply denounce their opponents as conspiracy theorists or worse. And it is somewhat baffling. If you think it was a fair election, presumably you would welcome inquiries into it. If you think that, this is really the medical fact about COVID-19, you would welcome inquiries and you would lay out the medical facts. And I found that instead, people simply respond with insults, ad hominems. The thing that I've been stressing to people throughout on any of these topics is always go to the primary sources. You have to read the papers in the medical journals because you won't get a fair account of them in the media. You have to do the same with various election sources, with all sorts of topics. And often you find that the report that's given in the media, to the extent that there's any appeal to argument at all, is really simplistic and one-sided and often just getting basic things wrong. That's not what the paper says that they're reporting on and so forth. So I agree. It's shocking the extent to which people resort to insults, not really as a last resort, but as a first resort, and don't even bother to make the case.
And John, people that are leading the charge are journalists and most of them, obviously, we would see them coming from the left, being liberals, and they're demanding that big tech censor other journalists and other people on these platforms. And it's coming from them. And of course, you have the Democratic Party establishment that likes this because, of course, they would prefer us to know that the first we have a Secretary of Treasury, a woman now, instead of talking about her involvement in maybe in the recent turmoil on the stock market here. I mean, it's always kind of shifting us away from is what Daniel said. What are the facts here? We can't even talk about facts. Go ahead, John.
Well, you've put your finger on a very important element in this, which is, as you say, the role of journalists. I mean, it's bad enough when governments try to restrict free speech or debate. But indeed, what is characteristic of recent times is that journalists, by and large, or what we call the mainstream journalists, no longer act on behalf of their readers and the general public to question the state, but instead act on behalf of the state to question and discredit their readers and the general public. So someone mentioned the world upside down a minute ago. That's one of the best examples. I think what is, we all understand, I totally agree with the previous speakers, that this cancel culture has extended way beyond. It was already bad enough in politics, but in 2020, it's extended, as the previous speaker just said, into issues of debate about medicines. The French newspaper of record, Le Monde, classified as fake news for a while before dropping it, the epidemiologist in Marseille, who was the first to talk about hydroxychloroquine. He was quoted as fake news. But that's a medical debate. Does this medicine work or doesn't it? It's absolutely not for a paper of record to brand such a thing as fake news. And obviously, the same applies to other areas, including historical debate. Areas in which precisely you only get to the truth by exchanging views are being closed down. But I think what is very frightening, almost more than these habits which have grown up, is that, of course, this is all being done without any respect for the law. Because when it is proposed to have, first of all, obviously we know about Twitter closing down Donald Trump. If Donald Trump had committed an offense, the offense of incitement, that might have merited some kind of punishment, whether impeachment or some kind of criminal conviction. But it doesn't merit being banished from Twitter before any judicial procedure, and still less banished for life. And the notion of a reality czar, in other words, of someone in the government, not someone in the judicial system, not a judge, not someone acting under the law, but someone acting presumably with the freedom that comes with executive power, that such a person or such an office should be in charge of policing fake news, is absolutely crazy. But I'm afraid we live in crazy times.
Well, it's happened in the past, okay, in other countries, and it's only a river of tears, okay? Let me go back to Tom. I mean, it's been mentioned, we can look at the situation that Donald Trump, private citizen Donald Trump is facing right now, is that, in looking at these proceedings against him, his second impeachment, what are the facts that happened on January 6th? What happened? And because there's no one in the media seems to be particularly interested in what really happened. And from what I know of what happened, it was awful, and people should be punished for breaking the law. Laws that already exist, laws that we don't need more of, okay? But this is the basic point here, is that if it was something done wrong, let's talk about it. What are the forensic facts? And we can decide what happened. But it's not being done. And I find that very frustrating. Someone is being put on trial without the facts being presented. I mean, if this isn't a perversion of our collective tradition of hundreds of years, I don't know what is. Go ahead.
No, it certainly is. And some of the major facts that are being overlooked right now in the Senate is the fact that the law enforcement in Washington, D.C. were warned by a branch of the FBI that there was going to be violence. They sent that information forward, as well as the New York Police Department. So the real question is, if you want to avoid this in the future, where did that information go? Why didn't law enforcement act on it? And in terms of, really promoting propaganda. I mean, the video that the Democrats showed in the Senate trial yesterday was appalling. There was no timestamp. They cut out the line where President Trump said, march peacefully and patriotically. They cut that part out. And they really just produced a Hollywood version of propaganda to drive their their agenda. And that's exactly what would happen if the government, U.S. government, had this ministry of truth. It would be nonstop propaganda to support the policies of the politicians in power.
Yeah, Daniel, one of the things that, when I look at this, and it is an extension of academia, this toxin came from academia and now is in the general culture. And it's willing things to be true. I mean, don't believe your lying eyes, okay? But, they want, it's just like it's almost a spiritual kind of thing of willing the truth on people. And if you don't accept, I mean, it's a cult. If you don't embrace it, not only are you an apostate, you must be disappeared. I mean, this is very, very extreme. And again, the intent is to destroy the public square, not only to control it. Go ahead, Dan.
Yes, I blame the Frankfurt School, and academia does have to really plead guilty for this, because we've harbored and really nourished and encouraged for more than half a century now, a group of people who believe in Marcuse's doctrine of repressive tolerance. They see a moral imperative to not tolerate things even when they're true. And they insist that if there's a concept of truth at all, which they usually put in quotation marks or, so-called truth or something, but they also then essentially say that's not a defense. There are things that shouldn't be tolerated, even if they're true, for the sake of some political ideal. And so it gives them a justification for suppressing the truth in the name of their politics.
It's not very often on television people talk about the Frankfurt School, but I'm very glad that it's being brought up here, because you're absolutely right. And these ideas are there. See, this is a political stratagem. This isn't a philosophical exercise. This is what bothers me about it. I mean, I found the Frankfurt School to be clever at times and interesting and nuanced, but it wasn't supposed to be a handbook towards power, at least as I read it. But that's the case. Go ahead, John. Last 40 seconds before we go to the break.
Well, it reminds me of an exchange, and unfortunately I can't remember either the date or the speakers, but there was an exchange between a journalist and a prominent neoconservative, and I guess it must have been around the time of the Iraq War, so the beginning of the 2000s. And the journalist asked a question about something about reality, and the neoconservative, whoever it was someone probably in the administration, looked at him with great hostility and condescension and said, he said, I see you belong to the reality-based community. But we, in other words, we in power, we create our own reality. You're a loser because you are stuck in reality where we're creating our own.
Wolfowitz said that. All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue more discussion on a reality czar. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about a reality czar. Okay, let's go back to Tom in Greenwich. I try to stay away from hyperbole. I really do, because there's so much of it you can see on cable and in the main broadsheets. But what I've been seeing, and it's something the media did as a reaction to Donald Trump, but it goes further back, but you can see these certain benchmarks here. What I see going on here is an ideology, in short, we can call it neoliberalism, and the dramatic events we've had over the last few months. This ideology wants to just completely dump and ditch the Enlightenment. They want to pretend it didn't even happen. Okay, and with their resources on the internet, they can start cutting away of these things. I mean, certain books that are, when is the Federalist Papers going to be considered, a bad book? And they're going to have, quote unquote, a burning of that too here. But the Enlightenment is the touchstone of here I stand, I can do no other. Okay, and there was a recognition of protected speech. Maybe they didn't call it then that, but there was that recognition. They want to get rid of that now. Go ahead, Tom.
No, they certainly do. And that's very frightening, globally. I mean, the point here is we advance society by having open and free discussion on any debate you can. And it's my thought against your thought, and may the best man or women win based on the facts. That's what's truly frightening. They're getting away from that. And one of the most disturbing things to me going on, lately is the whole origin of the COVID-19 virus. Was it naturally occurring, or was it an accidental leap from the Institute of Virology in Wuhan? That is a legitimate debate. But if you go out there in the public square and you say, I have evidence, circumstantial as it may be, that it probably did leak from the lab, they will shut you down. Even in the scientific community, there are people who cannot really express that freely. They will be shut down really by kind of a new scientific mob. And I find that frightening. And it's very anti-science when you really boil it down.
Yeah, but Daniel, I mean, if I don't want to open up a can of worms here in mentioning Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, but what they exposed in different ways is how the state lies to the public. Okay, where are the journalists? They were the ones that's supposed to do that in our lifetime. I'm looking at all of us here. They're the ones that put a pressure on power. Now, not always very well, not always with great precision. And some of these great investigative journalists became hacks later because they made a lot of money and got a lot of fame. But they're incurious to the 10th infinite degree now in informing the public. And no wonder people are going to other places to get their information. And there are bad actors out there that will feed bad information intentionally. How do you react to that? Go ahead.
You're absolutely right. What has happened to journalism schools and to the practice of journalism over the past few decades has really been appalling. For one thing, the best and the brightest don't tend to go into journalism. The School of Journalism is usually right down there, sadly, with the School of Education, the School of Social Work, in terms of the academic qualifications and so forth of the people who are there. But secondly, you look at what schools of journalism teach, and it has almost nothing to do with any actual subject that the journalist is going to be covering. It is at best.
They can't even write very well. Excuse me, but they can't even write very well these days. I'm sorry, keep going.
No, you're absolutely right. They don't teach writing. They don't teach anything really. And so people are covering science who have no background in science. People are covering economics who have no background in economics, who do not understand the first thing about what they're writing about. And in addition to that, they are indoctrinated with these attitudes about social justice and so forth that they bring into the profession. And I think they're incapable of being objective, even if they wanted to be, because they don't have the skills. So you've got this combination of incapacity and a happiness to become a propaganda organ. And it's a really horrible combination.
John, we have this perfect storm. Again, going back with my gripes against academia. I was in academia for a long time. But you have these undergraduate degrees and graduate degrees basically in social justice. Well, they're all essentially useless degrees. And some of them are quite expensive, but they have found a way. Now they're going to be the purveyors of equity, and they will work for the reality czar. They will be the shock troops for the reality czar. They found a place for them, okay? Because we see this all across the board. Where are your diversity people? Policing this, policing language, okay? Because again, they have this notion, which is completely antithetical to our traditions of knowing the truth. John.
Well, I think you're both right, both you and Peter and Daniel, to place the origin of the problem in philosophy on the one hand and in academia on the other, because this problem has been going on now. Of course, it's reached a terrible intensity recently, but it has been prepared over at least a generation, if not more so. I mean, Daniel, you mentioned the Frankfurt School, and I completely agree with that as a negative influence. But I'm afraid there are schools of liberalism as well, which are very close to Marcuse and the others. I'm thinking of Karl Popper. Karl Popper built his career, and as you know, he influenced George George Soros, saying that there was really no such thing as truth. And he went back as far as Aristotle and attacked Aristotle for having come up with this crazy idea that there could be a law of non-contradiction and other sort of primitive regressions, as he saw it, from the pre-Socratic ideal. And the result is, of course, that, as you say, Peter, the Enlightenment, which without, I mean, I'm not an enemy of it, but even if one isn't a fanatic of the Enlightenment, you can see that the people were essentially optimistic and they were interested in truth and all the rest of it. That is why, indeed, at one point during the Black Lives Matter protests in Britain, somebody started to have a go at David Hume. You can hardly think of a more respectable figure than him, because apparently he'd lent someone some money who was involved in slavery or some such rubbish. But it is very, very dangerous and very unpleasant, because as we have seen with the destruction of liberties in the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of this was in preparation for a long time, all the scaremongering, not about the virus, but about other things like climate change and so on. And now we have suddenly, very unexpectedly, found ourselves in a situation where we're all more or less living in police states. And unfortunately, I think, whereas before I might have said, oh, well, none of this will matter, because it'll never work and all the rest of it. I'm afraid I'm now of totally the opposite opinion. We have now suddenly had all our liberties abolished at the stroke of a pen, including very fundamental ones. And there is absolutely no reason at all why that should not extend to free speech and to free discussion, precisely because of this, I would say, at least a generation of people who are now in power, who have been brought up in exactly the universities you mentioned. So I'm afraid I'm full of foreboding about it.
Well, I am too. And my next question to all three of you will show my forebodings about all of this. What if we don't agree as we're dissenting on this program? Tom, what is our fate? Because every single, it used to be journalism was the, and I'm kind of be ironic here, was the safe space, okay, or a protected space. I hate using this lingo. But, now the journalists are not only on board, but their favorite pastime is to attack other journalists, okay, for questioning, okay? So what happens to people like us on this program and many of our viewers that say, I won't submit, I don't agree? What's going to happen?
Well, one of the biggest risks that we face is really with the social media giants. They could deplatform us and you in your program. So the three of us could be talking to the three of us, going forward. I think that's really one of the most frightening aspects of all of this, is the power of the social media giants to determine who gets on their platforms and when and what they get to say. And many of these platforms, they have their own kind of ministries of truth, and yet none of them have, backgrounds in science really to figure out really what is right or wrong. There was a time I was on Newsmax TV. I have a doctorate in biochemistry, and I was talking about hydroxychloroquine. Maybe it does this, was my point. Maybe it does that. I got deplatformed off of YouTube. And I tried to say why, and they wouldn't give me a real answer. I was right down the middle, didn't make a determination either way. I just happened to mention that word and that topic. So I think going forward, the real risk is really deplatforming people, isolating people in their own homes, not being able to communicate with each other. And I think part of that is what's going now with what they're trying to do with really silencing, the 75 million voters who voted for President Trump in the last election. I think they're trying to separate those people from the former president himself.
Daniel, one of the, as it's been explained to me by a number of people that I actually admire and respect, it's these platforms, they're a lot less willing to do this deplatforming and censorship, but they're under enormous pressure from the left. The left is putting a pressure on them to do this because most of them don't really care much about these issues. We are a very small minority on these platforms. We don't affect their bottom line whatsoever. We can't compete with puppies and kittens. There's no way, okay? No way. Throw in some sports, some cooking, and manicuring, okay? We can't compete because we're not part of their bottom line. And that's why, they'll say, you get these, the AOCs and people like that, to put pressure on us, and they'll say, it's a headache. Yeah, go ahead, fine, whatever. because they don't really care, because it doesn't affect their bottom line. And that's what really bothers me, because we can't have an impact that way. Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, yeah, I think that's right. It's both a problem within, say, the United States, where you're right, the puppies and kittens and cookie shows win, and anything intellectual is going to be doing extremely well to get, maybe 100,000, 200,000 views, when other things are getting millions of views. So it's trivial from that point of view. And then add in China, add in other places where they have potentially or actually much larger audiences, and where the government is in firm control of all speech. And yes, there's very little incentive for them to take freedom of speech seriously. Now, in addition to that, I think a lot of the people within the companies are social justice warriors and are happy to do it. And even those that aren't, I've known a couple of people who have actually worked for Google and for YouTube, censoring videos. And they're nice people. I don't think they're ideologues. But on the other hand, I wouldn't trust them to feed my cat for the weekend. I think
it's because they know nothing about the Enlightenment, and that's the scourge of our educational system. That's all the time we have, gentlemen. I want to thank my guests in Greenwich, Austin, and in Paris. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk.